In this presentation, we begin our study of Baroque counterpoint by looking at Baroque melody. Over the course of the Baroque counterpoint unit, we'll be building up our conception of counterpoint, first starting with one line, then starting with one line that implies multiple lines, then combining two lines together, and then three lines together. After that, a lot of the rules for 4 and 5 voice contrapuntal writing refer back to the tendencies that we see in 3 voice counterpoint. But we'll begin with this study by just looking at a single melodic line. Now, I discuss in this presentation most of the ideas in abstract, so make sure that you're listening to music and observing these qualities in that music that you're listening to and that you're writing and that you're analyzing, because if we're just conceptualizing them, we're not getting the full picture. In order to compress that amount of information and deliver to you in the most efficient way possible, it's here slightly bereft of specific musical references, but I highly recommend, for instance, listening to Purcell's If Music Be the Food of Love, which is a wonderful way to get into some of these ideas of Baroque melodic writing. First, we'll talk about idioms in the Baroque era. As we begin to study counterpoint, we'll be delving into a number of theoretical aspects that deal with style and idiom rather than just simple analysis of pitch. This means that technical discussions will often be used to highlight what are otherwise subjective elements, like the formation of idiomatic melodies and contrapuntal passages. We can't just look at a contrapuntal passage and say, well, that's a 4-chord. We can say that it reduces down to a 4-chord, but in terms of its harmonic implications. But there are so many other things that are going on. We can talk about the way that the melody is moving, the way that the parts are interacting, how dissonance is being controlled, the use of range, the use of imitation. And so some of these elements get into subjective aspects, aspects that are not objectively analyzable in the same way that we might be able to analyze just basic pitches in Roman numeral analysis. So we're going to start simple. We'll begin our contrapuntal study with melody, that is the formation of a single line, and then intensify those melodies, implying 2 lines with a single line, then combine melodies together. To begin with, we'll be examining the rhythmic aspects of Baroque melody, as well as the contour that these melodies often exhibit. First, we'll talk about rhythm. So we should talk about motivic unity, which is a big deal in the Baroque era. Baroque melodies often have a recurring unifying theme. It could be something as simple as running 16th notes, something referred to as moto perpetuo. If you know the Bach C minor prelude from the first well-tempered clavier, that has that running melody, or a lot of the Goldberg variations. Those have those running 16th notes and this feeling of moto perpetuo, or perpetual motion. Alternatively, it could be a collection of rhythmic cells that are consistently utilized throughout the composition. They don't have to be present in every single measure, but they often are. Creating a strong rhythmic unity in your melodies helps them cohere in this style. So whether it's a string of 16th notes or 8th notes, or whether it's a dotted rhythm that keeps recurring, whatever it is, if we have those ideas come back, it helps that melody cohere and sound like it's unified. In the Baroque era, we also tend to see limited use of substituted beat division. This is just a fancy way of saying we don't see tuplets that often. In general, the use of tuplets like triplets or duplets is the exception rather than the rule. In simple meters, beats are divided into 2s and 4s, so we avoid triplets. In compound meters, beats are divided into 3s, so we avoid duplets. Sometimes triplets will be used in simple meters. These will either be a constant motive or used at cadences or for a specific effect. Again, this is the exception rather than the rule to have the tuplets present. Some common global idioms that we'll see across large swaths of a piece. For instance, we might have the idea of a rhythmic accelerando. It's very common to see this idea of rhythmic accelerando where a piece proceeds from slower rhythms to faster rhythms. If you want a for instance of this, you can take a look at the slow movement of Bach's Italian Concerto. Moto perpetuo we already mentioned. Another common rhythmic idiom is to have constant rhythmic motion at a relatively fast pace, most frequently 16th notes. Note that one way this can be affected once we are using two voices is by alternating the motion between voices. So the top passage could have some 16th notes, the bottom could then answer. In the C minor prelude that I played shortly a little bit ago, everything, both hands have 16th notes all the time. Meanwhile, in the Goldberg Variations example, the left hand alternates between 8th notes and 16th notes. Likewise, the right hand. So if you combine those together, it sounds like there's a constant stream of 16th notes, even though they're alternating back and forth. It's a very effective way to add some variety so that we're not just having streams of 16th notes in all parts of the texture, but we alternate them back and forth. Let's talk now about contour, that is, the shape of the melody. In general, Baroque melodies frequently display an overall arch-like form, often with an initial ascent that opens up the melodic space, followed by a gradual descent to a cadence. We don't always have to have that, but it's a nice shape and it's a very common one. So if we're trying to emulate this, that's one thing that we could do. Most often, we tend to move by step rather than by leap. So stepwise or conjunct motion tends to be more common than leaping or disjunct motion. Also, faster moving notes are more likely to move in stepwise motion than in leaping motion. If we think about this from a vocalist's point of view, if we have a very fast scale that we're singing, it's much easier to do that in a stepwise fashion than if we have random leaps in the middle. That's very easy to play on the piano, but a little bit harder to sing, especially if those leaps get wider and wider. Now, that harmony wouldn't necessarily be sung in the Baroque era, but you can imagine that if you tried to sing quickly and throw in random leaps that are not carefully used, it would be more difficult. This does not mean that all of your melodies have to be stepwise all the time. It's just that if you tend to look at melodies of the Baroque era, particularly early Baroque or instances that are not heavily ornamented, we tend to see more steps rather than leaps. Also, the range of a phrase tends to be greater than a sixth. To maintain aural interest, a phrase of a melody will typically have a range that is measured from the lowest point of the melody to its highest point of a sixth, though reaching at least a seventh octave or more is more common and sometimes much more expressive. So if we think of one of the most widely known melodies throughout the parts of the world that know Western concert music is Beethoven's the Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Now, if we analyze that and we graded Beethoven's work based on these guidelines, he might not do so well. There's the uppermost note. There's the lowermost note. It just has a range of a fifth. Now, believe me, I'm a big fan of Beethoven. And one of the reasons that he, I think, uses this type of limited melody is because he wants it to be something universal, this universal song that anyone can sing. In fact, you can look online and you see, 1,000 recorder players playing the Ode to Joy or something. So the idea of this melody is that it is simple, and the fact that its range is smaller actually helps that idea. But most of the time, we're trying to emulate a style which is highly ornamented, very expressive. And so limiting that range tends to limit that expressivity. So having a range greater than a sixth is going to be much more common and much more idiomatic to the Baroque era. There's also going to be, in that range, unique high and low points. Also, to maintain aural interest, composers typically avoid repeating the highest and lowest points of the melody. And if they do so, they repeat it typically only once, or there's some exception going on. The over-repetition of these ceiling and floor notes can make the melody sound stagnant and redundant. Another thing that creates a feeling of stagnant or redundancy in Baroque-style melodies is circling. Occasionally, you might have circular melodies to generate momentum. This has to be balanced with other aspects. Overemphasizing one pitch can create a stagnant feeling. So if we just have one pitch that we are constantly going back around, and that's all that we're doing, it starts to sound more chant-like. Again, this is not necessarily bad. It's great in some styles. It's great in Stravinsky. It's great in modern music. It's great in earlier music. But in the Baroque era, circling around a specific pitch is the exception rather than the rule, because it doesn't give us that sense of expansiveness, that sense of expressivity that is so common in Baroque-style melodies. Now, every once in a while, you will have this. There is a wonderful Bach Prelude and Fugue in D major for organ that has the fugue subject that starts like this. Now, that's circling, if I've ever heard it. It's just going back and forth on several pitches. But after that motive, it becomes very leapy and very expressive. So what began as that circular motive then exploded. So it was being used to generate momentum. And we do see it in that context, but again, that is the exception rather than the rule. We also tend to see balanced leaps. Melodies in this style have a certain gravity. A large leap, so that's a perfect fifth or greater when we're moving slowly, or a fourth or even a third or greater when we're moving quickly, will tend to be preceded and followed by a step in the opposite direction. For instance, let's break this down. If there is a large descending leap, let's say we leap down an octave. That's certainly a large leap whether we're moving fast or slow. It will tend to be prepared by an upward step and left by an upward step. So we're leaping down, and there's a sort of bounce at the bottom. So we leap downwards, we bounce back up by step. And also we'll tend to prepare that by moving upwards. That just tends to be a very common melodic style in this idiom. And if we have consecutive leaps, that means one leap after the other, these will occur typically if they form chords idiomatic to the Baroque style. In other words, triads and seventh chords. So if we have multiple leaps in a row, they should form a harmony. Less common is, for instance, multiple fourths in a row. That sounds A, like Star Trek, and B, not like the Baroque era. But this does. That's a leap that we could have in the Baroque, or consecutive leaps that we could have. One exception that we might see is in the bass voice. Because the bass voice is providing a harmonic foundation, it tends to be just a little bit leapier and has more exceptions to this consecutive leap rule. Along these lines, Baroque melodies tend to imply functional harmonic progressions that are outlined by their leaps and by their contours. And they'll tend to move towards cadential arrival points, just like our harmonic progressions did. Let's talk about a few exceptions. As a line approaches a cadence, many exceptions occur. The cadential push frequently overrides other concerns because we want to draw attention to that moment. We want the listeners to, we want their ears to perk up and say, hey, this sounds different. This sounds interesting and strange, and it's because we're arriving at a cadence, we're arriving at a structural moment. If a note is approached by a large leap and then doesn't move, so if we had that large leap down the octave, and it just stays there, then the need to balance it is neutralized. In other words, relatively slower notes require relatively less balance. Ornamental notes, especially those of relatively short duration and on metrically weak parts of the beat, are not necessarily governed by these standard rules. They might appear and disappear very quickly, and we don't have to worry so much about balancing. But first, we're going to get this underlying structure before we worry about these additional ornamental notes. Also, pickup notes, or anacrusi, are essentially unaccented ornaments, and their leaping may not require resolution, especially as they are often part of a harmonic formation. Think about pickup notes that go from sol to do. We might immediately have an upward scale from there. And we don't necessarily feel the need to balance that upwards leap of a fourth. It sounds absolutely fine to go upwards from there. So in that case, we don't need to worry about it because it's that anacrusis, and it's more about setting up a harmonic expectancy, the sense of 5-1, that is just adding energy. So this gives you a sense of the basic guidelines for Baroque melodies. Go and listen to some, go and write some, and practice some of these aspects so that when we start layering lines on top of each other, the lines themselves make sense in and of themselves, and they sound like good melodies when they're played on their own.